Hello and thank you everyone to this month's Citrix webinar. Today's discussion topic will be Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. My name is Ken Liska. I am the Pre-Sales Engineering Manager for Citrix Public Sector State and Local Government team. Our presenters today will be Brian Beiser, Senior Systems Engineer, and Michael Paul, Lead Systems Engineer, both on the State and Local Government team. Today we're going to discuss corrections and rehabilitation. We're going to go through three different use cases that we see often in customer environments. Offender education and training, how to help out there. Staff and contractor computing, along with network security and optimizations. We'll do some key takeaways and a question and answer period at the end. If you do have any questions throughout, feel free to use the question dialog box on the side. I will do my best to make sure the questions get answered during. We will also have any additional question time at the end. If there's anything that's left open, we will follow up by email for those as well. So what are we seeing as common missions in Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation? What generally we see that you're all working on is just the ability to improve public safety through the rehabilitation and protection of offenders. We want to make sure effectively that when an offender comes into your system, they come out a better person. They come out either with better education, job skills, training skills, and or the ability to provide better in society. We want to also make sure that your staffs are properly able to safely handle that environment and securely do their jobs in detail if they need to do. So let me start off today's session with a quick poll question. So the first poll question is about leveraging SaaS applications or external websites to provide your offenders education and training. Are any of your organizations today using a SaaS web-based app for the learning management system, or are you participating in distance learning courses for a GED or a college program? Just very interested to see that. I'll give the poll about another 30 seconds to go, and then I will move forward and show the results. Okay, this is what the results of that poll looked like. And looking at the screen, I do apologize. The second choice should have said yes to remote education and no to SaaS apps. If anyone answered that, just curious if anyone answered meant to answer yes to remote education and no to SaaS apps, just toss a question up in the chat window and I'll just keep that in mind for the numbers for everyone and report that back. But with that, I'm going to pass it off to Michael Paul, and he will begin our first topic.
Thanks, Ken. So we're going to talk about offender education and training, as this seems to be one of the biggest areas that we see when we talk to our customers across the U.S. There's a lot of thought and process that has to go into offender education and training, and we'll start kind of talking about some of those common challenges, mainly being, application suites. So whether it's performance and maintenance of your LMS, so adult literacy, GED, college courses, etc. A lot of the things that we see out there being like a LexisNexis or case law libraries, etc., that offenders need access to for whether it's doing research into their own case or continuing education for rehabilitation. The way that we approach this is by essentially managing those applications and being able to deliver those out to those learning labs that the offenders would be using. There's monetary and real costs of maintaining these different applications and the legal libraries that are out there. By centralizing that and being able to deliver it out from the data center, we're able to lower that cost from a IT staff interaction perspective and being able to keep, the endpoints, I guess, as small as possible without giving a real footprint for contraband from the endpoints that are out there. So those are a few of the things that we come across when it comes to that. What we typically do around those challenges is, like I said, we centralize the management and deployment of those application suites. So whether it's an LMS or even just like a jail management system for being able to access that centrally from a single point or single endpoint. We have a different way of being able to deliver these out. So by centralizing these different applications, each I guess class, if you will, or offender, if they have different needs, we can just present out that application as the offender is logging into that specific workstation. So it doesn't have to have necessarily everything installed on the endpoint because we're centralizing that. We can just present out the applications or the learning modules that are needed for that specific class or learning opportunity. What that does and where we take that an extra step by centralizing that is we can do things like local browser lockdown. We can do automated recordings of sessions. So when offenders are on the PC or the endpoint, we can record that session because it's running in the data center as opposed to just on the endpoint. So we can have that for auditing purposes or training purposes. If it's SaaS-based applications or SaaS-based LMS, we have what we call secure browser. So if something does get, say, downloaded or maliciously done, it doesn't hit the corrections internal network, we would take the hit for that. So if there's a way for them to breach out of that system, that browser would be secure and set aside from your infrastructure, and we would take any hit that would come from that. Increase availability of resources because we would allow the applications to be delivered on any device or anywhere. We do actually have some customers in the correction space that have tablets or mobile devices that are allowed to specific inmates or offenders. So we do have the availability of resources being able to go to any of those devices at any given time. So if there's say like a window of time where they may be in their own cell, that they'd be able to grab their iPad or tablet and be able to launch a learning course directly from there rather than maybe going out to one of the learning kiosks that may be out there. Performance and security analytics for user experience. So we can take a look into what's happening from the user side of the house and be able to automatically kick off some of those things that I talked about, like session recording. So if it's deemed that the user is doing something that they shouldn't be doing or shouldn't have access to, we can automatically kick off a session record and start recording that session so you can go back and audit that and take appropriate action on that. From the endpoint perspective, we're able to reduce the need for IT staff to go out into those secure areas to physically have to deal with the endpoint. So when we start thinking about things like thin clients or zero clients or Raspberry Pis and Chromebooks, they're more of a low touch or no touch type of device, and the footprint of them starts to shrink quite a bit. I mean, in the case of a Raspberry Pi, we're looking at really small devices with a small footprint that has very few parts in it to be stolen. One of our internal favorite stories that we received from a customer is some of their PC endpoints in offender education were being torn or were being opened up, and they were taking memory sticks and creating shivs out of memory sticks. And there was another story from the same corrections facility that they were taking parts and essentially made their own, inmates were making their own Wi-Fi network out of parts that they were stealing out of PCs that were at the offender learning labs. So by being able to reduce that footprint and basically have nothing really on that, we minimize that risk and need for IT to be out there and start to try to drive down the amount of contraband that comes out of those PCs that are in the wild as well. That being said, I'm going to pass this over to Brian to kind of go over a demo of our secure browser and the session recording that we talked about. Let me just pass this over to Brian. Brian, you out there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Here you go, coming your way.
All right, and can you guys see my screen? Or
I can.
Perfect. So thank you for that, Mike. You did steal the story that I was hoping to tell, because still waiting to see that on a TV show somewhere. But anyway, as Mike was saying, one of the biggest places where we can assist is with those learning management systems, things like Pearson VUE, things like LexisNexis, these different SaaS apps that you may be running for your inmates, as well as different SaaS apps that you may be running for your back office staff, and the additional security controls that we can help put on it. So what you're seeing now is what we call Workspace App. And this gives me, when I log in, and we'll dive into this a little bit deeper in the next demo, is access to all the resources that I need. So I have my favorite applications, my desktops, as well as files that I'm accessing. And I can drill down into each of these here on the left. So if I were to open up a SaaS app, and I'm going to use Salesforce, for example. Whoops, sorry, just going to make me log back in. And as I am doing this, sorry. One thing to notice when we look at these applications, if I were to look at all of them, it's going to give me access to applications no matter where they're running or what type of applications they are. So if we're looking for something like Excel, which is typically a client server app installed specifically on the client, pulling the data either locally or from somewhere on the network, or if they happen to be SaaS applications, we do have access to all of that from within one space. So specifically what we were talking about was secure browser. And logging in right now, and if you noticed, it leveraged an integration within Okta, provided single sign-on into this application, and this could be LexisNexis, Pearson, whatever it happens to be. I have access to do whatever I would normally do functionality-wise from within the application. There's no additional controls over this. I can download files. I can highlight areas and copy and paste. All of that functionality is going to be there by default and continue to work. Now, when I go ahead and launch the secured version of this, as this is coming up, you'll see it's doing the exact same single sign-on. It's connecting, but it's adding different security policies that you as administrators can put on that particular application on a resource-by-resource basis. So we'll notice the major difference that you'll see as it's logging in is it gives me this watermark right here. So let's say that there is a testing app and somebody is taking screenshots to help the next person pass the test. We have a completely configurable watermark that can be added here, telling me my user account, where it's connected from. I can add things like date and time, the endpoint name, etc. I can also lock other things down. So if I go to copy a certain area, clipboard has been disabled. But I still have all of the functionality I need to take the test, to do my legal research, etc. But things like printing, copy and paste, downloading files, etc., have all been locked down within this secure browser. The other thing that Mike had mentioned that I wanted to show you guys is something called session recording. So this is our session recording player, and what this does, and you can kind of get as creative as you want for your use cases with this, but based on different security triggers, you kicking it off for training purposes, a whole host of reasons, whether it's support issues, it can take what that user is doing take a video of that session, and now I can export this and provide it back to that testing center, showing that this end user, this is what they did. If this happened to be an 8-hour workday and I wanted to look through what somebody was doing, I can stick it in fast forward mode. I can search throughout the video itself, and give me true visibility into what that end user is doing. And like I said, this could be leveraged for a whole host of things outside of the testing world, just to validate what end users are doing on your PC. If you have a new application that you're deploying to your internal staff and you want to put together a training video, this is a great tool to leverage for that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hand presenter back to Mike.
Thanks, Brian.
At the same time, Ken, I believe you have another poll that we're going to kick off. Give me 1 second.
Yep, that brings us to today's second poll. So for the second poll, we're curious on what's your organization's current stance on the cloud? Do you have a cloud first initiative? Are you starting to just dabble in the cloud, picking apps here and there when they make sense? Maybe it's a SaaS app for LMS, for example, or you're not yet using it, but you are actively investigating it, or you don't foresee any future plans in the cloud at the moment. Give you about 30 seconds to reply to that, then share the results. Okay, it looks like responses have stopped, so I'll close the poll and share. Here's what it looked like. So it looks like a pretty evenly split across the board, with either about a third of you have a cloud first initiative, or about a quarter of you have a cloud first initiative. About a quarter are starting to dabble. About a third are investigating, and about 10% of you are not yet looking at the cloud as a viable option. So I will pass it off to Michael now to talk about how we can help you with your staff computing needs.
Thanks, Ken. So we're going to jump into staff and contractor computing. Some of the challenges that we see with a lot of corrections is there's a mix and a variety of facilities, whether there's facilities and applications, whether there's legacy applications, remote sites, SaaS applications, on-prem applications, any flavor of cloud, whether it's AWS today and Azure tomorrow, maybe GCP 6 months from now, or whatever the case may be. We're starting to see a big hybrid type of compute seen across all corrections that we've been dealing with in the field. So supporting and maintaining that geographically dispersed user population, as well as the applications being all over the place as well, becomes a challenge, whether it's connectivity wise, whether it's just where do I go for this application, where do I go for that task, etc. Those are some of the biggest things that we see. Some of the other challenges being, ransomware and malware. We're seeing a very big uptake just in government alone, not just specific to corrections, but it definitely applies to corrections as well, where ransomware and malware is coming up, and we're even starting to see in the case of some places around the country where there's entities that are buying ransomware insurance. So instead of addressing the problem up front and maybe fixing the IT loopholes and security flaws that may be there, they're just going out and buying insurance to be able to pay off the hackers when that happens, and it's just kind of perpetuating that problem. It's a really interesting article. We just saw about that a few weeks ago for a specific municipality that actually just did that and essentially paid X amount of dollars to insurance to pay their ransomware to get their environment back. It's really, really interesting stuff that's going on out there. But leveraging mobile devices and tablets from a third-party contractor and staff perspective, there's devices everywhere, whether it's at home, whether they're being issued devices from a phone perspective or tablets. How do we manage those? From a BYO perspective, do you need something like a geofence in place? Those are some challenges that we have come across. And then optimizing workflows for field workers. So a lot of government is still very form-based and paper-based. So we come across that as a pretty big challenge as well. And how can we digitize that to move that into more of a user-friendly atmosphere as well? So what have we done to address some of those challenges? So again, kind of centralizing the delivery of those applications, whether they're Windows apps, SaaS apps, on-prem web apps, or Linux apps, whatever the case may be. Like I said, those jail management systems, they have a lot of modules to them, whether it's healthcare, whether it's just prison management on its own. How do we actually do that? So we don't really care, again, from what device the user is coming from. So it could be an Android, a Mac, a Windows, Raspberry Pi, Zero Client, etc. We don't care what device they're coming in from, because we're centrally hosting those apps. We'll be able to present them out to whatever device they're leveraging for that specific session. From a IT perspective, we're enabling you to leverage the cloud, including government cloud options. So whether that's Azure Gov, AWS Gov, we have our control plane in a Gov cloud. We call it Citrix Cloud Government. We have the controls that would be needed around a cloud environment as well. So from our architectural perspective from cloud, a lot of vendors would talk about bring your stuff to our cloud or your data to our cloud. That's not really what Citrix Cloud is about. It's really about enabling you to leverage the cloud resource that you would like to use. So you're in charge of your data. All we do from a Citrix Cloud perspective is enable you to place your data in the cloud or data center of your choice. So it could be an on-prem data center, and that runs half the workloads, and maybe the other half of your workloads are running in Azure today. What our control plane does is allow, kind of think of it like a traffic cop, where a user logs in, requests a specific resource. Our control plane takes a look and says, oh, that resource resides over here in your on-prem data center. Send that user over here for that resource. Now they've requested another resource, but that lives in Azure. Then send them to there for that specific resource. So what Brian was showing from that Workspace app, where it showed SaaS apps, on-prem apps, cloud apps, from a user perspective, they don't really care where it is. They just need to get to it. So we give them an insight into all of the items that they have access to, but we don't care where it is on the back end. We'll just point them to wherever that resource is running and be able to launch it with all of our protocols and security that Brian brought up around that. From a protection from malware and ransomware, via non-persistent virtualization. So what we mean by that is, because we have non-persistent images on the back end hosting those application suites that we're discussing, if something does get infected, you reboot it and it goes back to that clean image. So if something would happen, and we have many ways to mitigate something from even happening, but if something would get downloaded or something would get installed onto one of those images, all it is a reboot. So there's no going back and rebuilding your environment. There's no going back and doing mitigation on specific endpoints, because we've taken the OS off of the endpoint and we've centralized that to the data center, that we can just do a reboot and go back to clean. From collaboration perspective, we're able to kind of do the same thing, where if you have OneDrive for Business that's out there, let's say there's some Google Drive, maybe some Dropbox or Box, we're able to aggregate all of those files into one spot for users as well, and be able to give them a one-stop shop for all of their files, whether it's network shares on-prem, home drives, SharePoint on-prem, SharePoint in the cloud, like I said, OneDrive for Business, etc. It's that one-stop shop for users to get to every resource that they would need. And then from establishing a trust and security for data on mobile devices, we kind of talked about, I mentioned geofencing. That's a big one that we see in the corrections industry, where if a device leaves this geofence, maybe turn everything off or wipe it or factory reset it, whatever the case may be, we can add that geofence around whatever specific parameters you would put. So if there's a device that shouldn't leave a specific, say, cell block, we could just geofence around that cell block. If it's a device that just shouldn't leave the corrections facility in general, we can make the geofence that. We could make it the whole city, whatever we wanted to do from a geofence perspective, and then however you wanted to handle that from a policy violation perspective, we'd be able to apply a policy based on that. When it comes into, bring your own device, it enables you to allow users in to the environment through their device, but not touching their personal items as well. So we can do things like mobile application management, where it protects the organization data within the device that the user is using. We'll just, secure that specific container or application that we're putting on that device, but their personal side is not affected. So if the user would leave the organization or the third-party contract would not be renewed, you can just wipe the organizational data from it without touching their personal phone. It really allows you to expand that relationship with the contractors you have and your staff by not having to allow them to carry multiple phones and, kind of take that fear of, I don't want you with access to my device. We can just do that mobile application management. For corporate or government-owned devices, that's where the full mobile device management comes into play, where you could do things like tracking the device, do things like geofencing, et cetera. And that's kind of an overview of what we see with staff and contractor computing. It definitely goes up far and beyond this, but this is some of the general stuff that we see from an overall perspective. And I'm going to actually pass this back to Brian to give us a demo on the full workspace that I talked about. So just to kind of set you up for that, Brian, that aggregation point that I was talking about is what Brian's going to show you right now.
Exactly. Thanks, Mike. So Mike, just to confirm, you can see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. So as we were talking about a little bit earlier, as Mike just dove a little bit deeper into, we talked about that central aggregation point for all of those resources that we're looking for, apps, desktops, as well as the data that backs that up. And this is going to be the same consistent environment, look, feel, touch, whether I'm connecting from my MacBook, PC, Raspberry Pi, mobile device, whatever it happens to be. So we took a brief look at the applications, and we discussed how we can pull in a number of applications, whether it be client server, SaaS apps, mobile apps, etc. We also have the ability to present full desktops, and there's different reasons why some people might choose to do one over the other. Not a lot of time to talk about that today, but highly recommend reaching out to your local sales team. They'd be happy to dive into that based on your use cases. And the last piece for that aggregation point is files. So if you've got users today who are just looking to transfer large files, solve problems on their own, and nothing is locked down, so you might have people with information in Dropbox, Google Drive, etc. Or maybe you have policies around OneDrive and you allow that, but there's still network shares. This does give you a centralized location to access all of that data. For example, the network shares, wherever they're residing on site, we're not creating a full VPN, but we're giving you secure access just to those single resources you need. Also, if you're looking to move off of something like Dropbox or Box, you have the ability to access them all from one single point, have the users pull down their files and place them within the file structure that you've created and where your policies allow them to be, and then block access at that point. Now, while there's multiple ways to access this, so we've kind of looked at Workspace, one of the easiest ways, and this is how I use this tool multiple times a day, is right through our Outlook plugin. So if I'm sending a new email, and these policies can be set by the administrator, as well as give the end user the ability to add additional policies around a specific application. So just as easy as I would click attach file, right within the ribbon bar, we're going to attach a file via share file. And some of those policies that I was talking about, it gives me the ability to be notified when the end user accesses the file that I've sent to them, what security is around that file, how long that file is available, and how long until that link expires. What type of access does that recipient have? Can they download it? Do we want to add a watermark to it? Do they have full control over that file? And how many times do we want that user to be able to access that file? So if I were to send Mike a large file, let's say something that was 4 meg, instead of clogging up my outbox, my exchange queues, etc., this is just sending a small link. So instead of that 4.4 meg, we're talking about a couple of K. So I can go ahead and send this. And historically, if you guys have ever worked with an Outlook, which I'm sure you have, you realize maybe I sent the wrong file. And when you try to recall something, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. I don't remember the last time I even tried to use it. But the fact that we're just sending a link to it, or even if the user has downloaded that file, that it is encrypted when they download it, and it would need to touch our control plane to then access the file, I can, in a simple click, revoke access, and that end user can no longer open, download, whatever access they had originally to that file, or even view it. So that's kind of Workspace in a whole, access to all of those different resources you need, how you can share resources internally and externally to the agency. So I will hand it back over to Ken for the next poll and to Mike to continue the presentation.
So, and our last poll today is, where do you have the most challenges with your IT security? Is it securing the services you offer to the offenders, whether it be the education or legal research, trying to keep your staff devices and application delivery secure, general protection of your network, making sure your network connections and access are secure, or just meeting all the various compliance regulations you have to comply with, or all of the above? Give a few moments for the poll to fill up. Okay, it looks like responses have stopped, so share this one out. It looks like about an equal split between securing the offender environment and just meeting compliance concerns. So this next section, Mike should be able to give some good advice there as well. Off to you, Mike.
Thanks, Ken. Let's share back out here. Perfect. So thank you everyone for answering that poll. That kind of sets us up for this next section of network security and optimization. So the two biggest areas being offender education and compliance areas for challenges that everyone's put out there is kind of right into our wheelhouse. So, you know, when we talk about things like FIPS, HIPAA, PII, PCI compliance, CGIS needs, you know, we have, they're all essentially architectures, right? They're architectures that, you know, you need to be able to satisfy the compliance needs for that specific regulation. So if it's something like, say, PCI, right? You need to have any of those payment card systems segregated from everything else in that network. Our architecture for doing that from an infrastructure side is PCI compliant by segregation, and then allowing different security parameters to get into that specific PCI environment. Some of the HIPAA type of stuff, we kind of already touched on some of the things like secure browser. So if there is a SaaS-based, say, module for your medical reports, we can do things like watermarking, etc. So if something does get leaked or someone decides to take a picture from their phone of their screen, we know where that's originating from and where that HIPAA breach may be coming from. So we have ways to be able to address some of those regulations that are out there. From a FIPS perspective, we have FIPS encryption 140-2 in our products as well. So if there's specific needs that you have around these regulations, please reach out to your local sales team, and we'd be happy to discuss how we achieve those compliances and regulations through the architectures that we have for each one. From a network optimization perspective, if we look at remote locations, so we kind of touched on this before with staff and contractors and just the geographically dispersed nature of corrections. A lot of sites have limited bandwidth. Me personally, I'm located in Colorado, and I know the corrections team here. We have some pretty sparse and rural locations with not the best connectivity. So we have ways of doing things like SD-WAN to leverage, backup lines or even satellite links if we need to, and be able to aggregate those lines to help improve the experience from a connectivity perspective. So we're doing some really cool things around, like I said, high latency, high bandwidth type of connections like satellite. And just to kind of give you a background on what we're doing with that, just inside of the protocol that we leverage to deliver applications, we're able to be resilient from some pretty high packet loss and high latency inside of these environments now. So think about like delivering an application over a satellite link. It's typically a high bandwidth type of connection, but the latency is pretty bad. So we've seen environments that are 500 milliseconds latency working well within this type of delivery system and environment. So if that's something that you'd like to dive a little bit deeper into, again, reach out to your local team and we can do a deeper dive just on the links that we can work with and make the remote sites a little bit more resilient. Inside of all of that, or part of all of that, just being things like contextual access. So we can restrict access into these sites from, just specific IP ranges. We can do things like endpoint analysis to understand, what is the user trying to come in from. So let's take a third-party contractor, for example, right? What if they're trying to access the system from a home PC that's Windows XP, right? I mean, maybe that's not something that's very secure, and you don't want them to have all of the same access they would have if they were sitting at the facility on a government-owned asset that's patched and fully compliant with what you would normally want. We can turn things off. We can still maybe allow them into, say, their email, because we're okay with email, but then we'll turn off virtual channels like copy paste or USB drive redirection, or printing, or any of these types of things that we pass through that virtual channel. We can stop that interaction between that endpoint, that XP endpoint, but still allow them to maybe do some work, but not everything that they would normally be able to do. So maybe you would allow them to see access to email, but not full access to, say, the JMS system or the prison management system. Maybe they wouldn't have access to the healthcare module or or some of the education stuff that they would normally get. Maybe you're just only allowing them access to their email if their endpoint is not compliant. So I kind of talked about some of this stuff on this slide already. The lower cost alternatives to backup links is probably one of the biggest things that I'd say that we've been helping with, just because of the geographic nature of corrections. So if there's anything that you wanted to dive deeper in on any of these items, please let us know. And like I said, we can dive into it with your local team. But our architecture definitely can meet, CJIS compliance, HIPAA compliance, PCI, et cetera. I don't know if any of you ever realize or notice, but most just major healthcare systems, when you walk in, A good portion of them are leveraging our technology just to deliver their EMR and EHR system, and we are able to meet their HIPAA compliance in the private sector for that. So we're able to do that in the public sector as well, and just ask us how we achieve that in your specific scenario. That being said, Brian, I'm going to pass it over to you to kind of give us a demo on Citrix Analytics. So we kind of talked about this earlier, at how we can see what's happening into the end user computing environment, and Brian's going to show us what that means.
Great, thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate that. So as I'm getting ready to show my screen here, we've looked at and talked about a number of different aspects of this solution, being virtualizing desktops and applications, secure access to not only those resources, but as well as the files, policies around mobile devices and geofencing and things like that. What really ties the story together is the analytics piece of it. So all of these different components of the solution, whether they be networking, virtualization, mobility, etc., we're able to leverage machine learning policies that you guys put together and define, and get a really good view of what's going on within your environment, where you should have concerns around things, where you might want to act on them, but not only be in that reactive mindset, but in a proactive mindset, and actually have different actions kick off based on things that are happening within the environment. So when I go ahead and log into the analytics dashboard, I'm going to get a view of all of my different users out there and who's considered high risk based on these different things that have been defined in the actions and what those users are doing, who's a medium risk, who's a low risk. And I can go in and I can dive a little bit deeper into, so Joss has a score of 98 out of 100, has been defined glaring red. This is a high risk user. So let's figure out what this user has been doing, what the system has done around it, what administrators have done, and really understand what might be going on with that account. So it's broken up by date, and there's going to be different alerts to the system. So there were large file uploads, and this is, you know, a medium trigger over here, and there was an excessive use of files being brought up, but that might be considered a low-level alert. But then something, it was accessing our data loss prevention system. So now all of a sudden sensitive files are being accessed that this user should not have access to or should not be accessing. So what happens at that point? We start off, we can dive in deeper. We can look at the number of files that were accessed, what was accessed, where it was coming from, get more contextual information about that. And then a session recording was kicked off, so we can see what the end user is doing with that. Continued to upload some large files, accessed more things that by the DLP system has been flagged as sensitive. Now they're pulling down a lot of files. There's unusual access to a specific SaaS application. Mike had mentioned earlier, within our networking solution, we can do an endpoint analysis scan. So looking for things like, is this patched properly? Is it running antivirus? Is this machine joined to the domain? Is it allowed to access resources? Now all of a sudden we see that this user went ahead and tried to connect 3 different times within a couple of minutes from a jailbroken device. This device also had blacklisted apps on there. There were authorization failures, and we can dive in deeper and look and get specific actionable information. Based on the mobility policies, it took this information and we went ahead and locked that device out. So that device can no longer access the system. And you'll notice over here, there's a lot of different pieces that we can pull in. and a lot of different actions that we can take based on what that user's doing, whether we want to disable their access, log them off the session, do things like session recording, or just send out a text message to our admins letting them know this is what's going on, and you might want to look into this a little bit deeper. One other thing I want to take a quick look at was just where these policies are coming from and how you would define one. So if we wanted to go ahead and create a policy, we can see that we have all kinds of different conditions that can be met, whether it's accessing sensitive files, unlimited upload volume that we saw, jailbroken devices, etc. And then it'll go through and we can determine what that action should be. And it's that simple. I know we only have about 10 minutes left and I do want to be cognizant of time. So I would like to open it up and just ask Ken, if you've been monitoring, have any questions come in that Mike and myself can help answer? Oh, actually, no, I apologize. Mike, you were going to wrap it up and then we were going to do questions. I should have paid more attention to the agenda. So
no worries.
Sorry about that, Ken.
I'm going to grab this back. So just some of the key takeaways from what we talked about today. Just wanted to kind of recap everything that we talked about. So kind of thinking about helping the organization meet those compliance and required security standards that are out there. We have the reference architectures to meet things like PCI, HIPAA, CGIS, FIPS compliance, etc., but also adding that AI-backed analytics to provide increased visibility for your end user computing environment, whether that be offender education or staff computing or third-party contractors. Number two, improving that security, performance, and reliability over those low bandwidth connections. We talked about being able to aggregate links with things like SD-WAN and be able to optimize the delivery of the virtual environment to remote sites, and that could include 4G, satellite connections, etc. Number three, locking down and protecting the browser-based connections for SaaS apps. So we showed how we can turn on a watermark for SaaS applications and kind of start to secure and rein in the wild world of SaaS that's out there now. For what we're seeing is, you kind of can do a single sign-on and users are just kind of in the wild. They can download, print, copy, paste, take pictures, whatever the screenshots, etc. Do whatever they'd like with that SaaS data. We're giving you a way to kind of take that back. Number four, providing easy Outlook and mobile device integrated, fully audited, and secure file sharing for users inside and outside of your organization. When we talk about that, again, it's just to reiterate that we're aggregating all those different file repositories into a single space for a user and being able to interact with that directly from that workspace. So again, users don't need to know where to go to find this file or where to go to find that file or what they need to use to open this file or that file. Our infrastructure is doing that for them and aggregating that into one spot. And then number five, being cloud ready. There's a lot of people out there that they're looking into cloud for the first time, or they have a cloud first initiative. Solutions can be deployed anywhere with our solution. We can do on-prem, we can do hybrid, you can do multiple clouds, you can do hybrid multi-cloud. We don't care what specific cloud you're using. If there's specific features in Azure Commercial that you need to use today, but tomorrow they're available in Azure Gov, we can easily spin that up in Azure Gov for you. We don't really care where they are. We are cloud agnostic to help you be able to move and migrate workloads between on-prem and cloud easily without too much stress for your staff. So that being said, we'll open it up for questions. Ken, I'm going to bring you back in as you've been moderating the questions and see if there's anything that's come up.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So the first question, which is, are we going to be sharing the presentation and will the slides be available? The answer to that is yes. After the presentation, we'll have both the recording of the webinar and the slide deck available for download. Some more questions that have come in. So Brian, about the session recording you demonstrated earlier, when an administrator kicks that off, does the user have to be notified that they're being recorded?
No, great question. It's actually configurable based on your requirements. So the quick answer is no. You can choose to either notify the end user or just have that session record without notification.
Okay, I'll throw a couple other bonus questions out there myself based on that as follow-ups. On average, like how big is a recording file? Is that going to fill up the hard drives for the system using it?
Sure. So that's really going to be dependent on what the end user is doing. So obviously, accessing things like the Office suite would be a smaller file with less deltas than, say, streaming video. But I believe, according to the documentation and from what I've actually seen out there, in an 8-hour shift, if you were recording somebody's entire session and they were just, let's say, within Outlook all day long, 20 megs is reasonable. You probably want to estimate closer to 100, and then you can determine kind of your archival requirements past that to figure out your storage needs.
Thank you. And I'll throw this one over to Michael just to follow up to get him some action. I'd be concerned, Michael, if there was session recording available of one of my administrators being able to record somebody's session and then delete the logs later on that they didn't record it. Do we protect against that happening?
Yeah, we have full administrator configuration logging, so we know what happened to that recording, who deleted it, when it was deleted, what the session was, etc. So we can give you insight into what was happening from those recordings as well.
Okay. So another audience question was, can we lock down contractor devices if we're allowing like contractors to bring their own laptops or a BYO differently than our organization based on what device they are, whether it's we own the device or they own the device?
This is Mike. I'll take that one, Brian. Yes. So we can create different policies for different endpoints that are out there, whether it's a mobile device or a laptop. If it's a government-owned asset or a personal-owned asset, we can definitely configure that however you'd like to. It just comes down to defining those parameters that you'd want to put in place and making sure that we apply those to the correct devices. So we can do things like, if it's a domain joined device, apply these policies. If it's not, then apply those type of policies. So it's just a matter of what you want to do and defining that, and then we would just walk through that process.
Okay, and I'll throw this one up to whichever one of you wants to answer this. So if an organization decides they want to leverage Citrix Cloud, do they have to move everything to the cloud today, or can they still maintain their classified resources on premises? I'll go to Brian on that one.
Sure. So first of all, Citrix isn't pushing any kind of a forklift. And I think that's an important point to realize, that we give you the ability to migrate at your own pace. Now, that being said, with things like sensitive data, whether they need to reside within the walls of your data center, being a resource location or a secure data center like an Azure Gov, those resources can exist anywhere. And as Mike said, we're just providing the control plane to put the security around it and provide that delivery platform. So your secure resources or your will stay secure and can reside on-premise, in the cloud, or in a hybrid mix, depending on your use case.
Thank you, Brian. So I'll pass it back over to Mike. Mike, if a customer is using Citrix Cloud, can they leverage Microsoft Enterprise, Windows 10 Enterprise VMs, or can they leverage Managed Desktop service for Microsoft?
Yes. So Microsoft has announced what they call WVD, or Windows Virtual Desktop, and that does open up the possibility for multi-session Windows 10. And we are day one availability for leveraging Windows Virtual Desktops as a resource location. So we can definitely take full advantage of multi-session Windows 10, wrap all the security that we talked about around that today, being able to deliver it across high latency, low bandwidth type of links as well. all of the things that we talk about would apply to that. We would just look at that as another, what we call resource location in the cloud.
Okay, thank you very much. We've reached the end of the questions. If anyone else has any more questions, I'll stay on the line for a few more minutes. We'll stay on the line for a few more minutes just in case. But for now, I will say goodbye and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.